Hello and welcome to the webinar. This is a Washington, D.C. update where we'll go through federal government policy developments. This is a webinar of One Voice for Manufacturing. It is supported by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. I am Caitlin Sickles. I'm a senior principal at the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. We do the strategic communications for NTMA and PMA through One Voice. Also on today's webinar, you will hear from the guys at the Franklin Partnership. You'll hear from Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. You usually hear from my colleague Paul Nathanson, also at Bracewell, but he is not on today's webinar, but will be back next time. There's, as usual, lots to cover on the webinar. We'll talk about what's going on in Congress, and as you've probably seen, we have significant updates there on an important tax bill, so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what's going on in the regulatory context, and then we'll go a little bit into trade and tariffs and supply chain issues. On this slide, this is a new slide we don't usually have, but it was a recommendation of a GATT team member, that's the government affairs team for One Voice, and I think it's a great idea. This is an overview slide of everything we're discussing here in the month of February on this webinar. So you can quickly see, like I said, lots of content, but for folks who download this presentation and see it in the future, you'll be able to see what all was included in this presentation. With that, I am going to turn it over to John, give us a highlight of what is going on in Congress.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hello, everybody. That summary slide really shows how busy things have been in Washington, not just on Capitol Hill, but in the federal agencies as well in the rulemaking process. But happy Jobs Day today. For those who haven't seen it, there was a big jobs number that was reported today, double what the people predicted. So we'll see what's happening. The lingering issue that we've bringing up webinar after webinar is FY24 spending bills. The Congress punted again. As you recall, we've been living on a continuing resolution, and the continuing resolution were set to expire in January and early February, and they have now punted it once again. They've delayed it to March 1 and March 8. But the key element here is that the numbers in the Congress are so slim. Right now, there's only 219 House Republicans, 212 House Democrats. They have a slim 1 or 2 seat majority. So depending on if a member of Congress wakes up with a cold or wakes up in a bad mood, essentially governing majority could be turned over to the minority party. So that's what's making it difficult to pass some of these appropriations bills. They are baby crawling to the finish line. There's a thing called the 302As and 302Bs. The House and Senate have agreed to the top line spending, which is the 302As, and the appropriators have agreed on the 302Bs. So now each appropriations subcommittee knows how much they can spend, and they can start moving this process. As I'd mentioned, the first deadline where 20% of the government funding runs out is on March 1st. These are supposed to be the easy appropriations bills: agriculture, Food and Drug Administration, energy and water, military constructions, Veterans Affairs, transportation, and HUD. If these are the easy ones, and not a single one of them have passed both the House and Senate, you can imagine how difficult it's going to be when we get to the March 8th deadline, where some of the larger bills and the more controversial bills and bills that are really important to One Voice members, Department of Commerce funding, for example, the Department of Labor, DOD, Department of Defense, Homeland Security. So if the Congress hasn't passed any of those easy ones, it's certainly going to be difficult to pass those larger ones. And I think Omar and I both agree that we're looking at they're going to have to probably do one more continuing resolution to keep the government funding before they end up doing a year-long CR. Keep in mind, we started the FY24 fiscal year on October 1 of last year. But the big news is the strong bipartisan passage of a tax bill on January 31st. And for those of you who are participating in this webinar and who responded to our action alert to contact your senators and members of Congress to pass this tax bill. Thank you very much. You know, we often talk about the partisanship in Washington, and you hear in the news about the partisanship in Washington. But bipartisanship is not dead. This tax bill passed overwhelmingly, 357 yeas to 70 nays. So, and that was after a strong bipartisan vote at the House Ways and Means Committee. I think the vote was 40 yeas to three nays. So what this bill does, it reinstates the R&D expensing retroactive to 2022. It ends the requirement to capitalize and amortize your R&D. It reinstates 100% expensing, which many of you refer to as bonus depreciation. It reinstates the business loan deductibility, EBITDA, or your 163J. And what the Ways and Means Committee did is they enhanced Section 179 expensing to $1.29 million. And so if you're going to give all of these tax cuts, people say, well, how was it paid for? Did this just increase the budget deficit? No. What they did was as of January 31st, they eliminated the employee retention tax credit. That was something that we worked to enhance during the COVID. And by eliminating the ERTC, they're saving $78 billion, which covers the cost of the tax cuts.
Yeah, so what they're doing here is they're shutting down further claims. So now that we're into February, it's about 36 hours ago, you're no longer permitted to file an application. So if you do have one of our members that is still waiting on final resolution of a refund of your employee retention tax credit, those are still going to be processed. They have about 1 million in the backlog. They are separating some that are going through the additional level of scrutiny. So if you have an ERTC that you did get in ahead of the January 31st deadline, that will still be processed. So the program will still remain open. What they did is they stopped the additional application. The deadline initially was going to be April of 2025. And by shutting it down about 14, 15 months early, that's how they're able to generate that savings. So if you're already in the hopper, you should still have at some point resolution. But now if you had not submitted prior to the 31st, then it's too late. But John, next steps there are still kind of murky in the Senate.
So as you know, the bill passed the House in a bipartisan way. It moves over to the Senate right now. This bill was a negotiated agreement between the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Ron Wyden, and the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith from Missouri. And so now this bill goes over to the Senate, and in addition to those business tax provisions, they also included, to attract Democrat votes, quite candidly, they and we've talked about this in previous webinars, is they included language to enhance the child tax credit. They added some low-income housing tax credits, and many Senate Republicans are now pushing back on this agreement. They say, why are we taking what the Democrat chairman of the Senate Finance Committee is doing? We want to take our own bite at the apple and consider this. The problem is that any delay, any amendments, any changes to this bill that passed the House with 357 votes means it's going to have to go back to the House for reconsideration. And our goal is to get enactment of this tax bill by February, so it could be part of the tax filing season. If the Senate does end up amending it, it looks like we may miss that February window. I'll explain in a minute why. And we may have to then put this tax bill on an appropriations. And as we've mentioned in previous webinars, and I've mentioned earlier, the appropriations process is so screwed up right now. It's so difficult to pass a bill. To add something controversial like a tax bill on top of it, it is troubling.
And you take a look at what the Senate might be considering. So where Senate Republicans, in particular those that are on the Finance Committee, felt that they were not included in the process, right now they've narrowed their focus. You see on the top of this slide, it mentioned about the House having a vote next week, and likely will, on doubling the SALT deduction, or at least a rule on the bill that would take it up to $20,000 deduction for filing jointly married couples earning under $500,000. That likely will fail next week. But what the Senate is thinking about doing, at least Senate Republicans on committee want to clarify on certain they'll call illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, that potentially would be claiming the child tax credit, because again, their children would be born here in the United States, which makes them citizens and eligible to claim it. And so they're trying to do some clarifications there and addressing some other issues that really are non-issues, but have now become the perception based on some widespread misperceptions that are out there. So that's where some of the Senate issues are going to be. But to John's point, if we do now have to do any changes over there, that's going to be extremely problematic because, John, we did the math, and Senate and the House are only together for 3 days in February. So if they were to make changes and send it back, it's tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that is why we're going to continue to push and reach out to particularly Senate Republicans on the Senate Finance Committee and talk about the urgency of getting this done, and reminding them of how important fixing the R&D and 100% expensing is to One Voice members. So
yeah, and take a look at your timeline one more time in a summary. We are now through the House. You will not likely see this go straight to the floor this week in the Senate, which now puts it at the earliest would be February 23rd, which makes it unlikely if the committee of jurisdiction does not move forward, or at least they're allowed to do something on the floor. If the bill were to go fully to the floor, it could take up to 2 weeks on the floor, given the amount of cloture votes that are permitted over in the Senate chamber. So regardless, the math we just gave you does not show a pathway really to getting this signed into law prior to March 1st, unless there's some considerable capitulations by Senate Republicans, which at least now that you've got some of those more level-headed policy people like John Thune, who's the #2 Senate Republican, and he's from South Dakota. He's a real policy person, and now he's saying they want to make changes. That means Senate Republicans aren't going to let this get to 60 votes, most likely. So for your timeline purposes, it looks like it's going to be a tough month of February, to John's point, and we'll keep on going. But also to John's point, no shortage of other topics going on from the regulatory space. We put enough time into last month's webinar walking you through the apprenticeship proposed rule that the Department of Labor issued or previewed on December 14th. For those of you that would like more information on it, you can click on the link on the bottom right, and they do have a landing page, and you'll be able to go through the webinar presentation that they held last Thursday on January 25th and give you an overview of what they're talking about. And the highlight there and the way it affects your industry the most is by eliminating the ability to use competency-based apprenticeship programs or a combination of competency plus time-based. It would go to only a 2,000 hourly time-based approach for registered apprenticeship programs, which could be a disadvantage to a number of our manufacturers and also to their employees that would seek to be in a registered apprenticeship program. Encourage you to take a look at that. We will be drafting comments that are due on March 15th, and please reach out to me if you'd like to provide any further input on that as well. A few other areas that have come up that we previewed previously were coming. We do now have a final rule. And just to clarify, when we say a proposed rule and a final rule, it's just like it sounds. A proposed rule is a proposal that an agency puts forward for input from the public and stakeholders, and a final rule is one where they've already received that input and now this to the decision-making time. This is one that deals with the classification of independent contractors. We've been working with coalition partners and then going back to the rules change in 2021 in January that would have allowed employers more flexibility. This rule change definition of who is considered an independent contractor and who is considered a full-time employee of the shop can lead to a number of misclassification and a lot of confusion coming up. You might also have to work with your labor attorneys to review some of your employment agreements, in addition some of your contractual agreements that you may have with some individuals that you currently could consider as independent contractors. That's something definitely to watch. This is now a final rule. It will be taking effect on March 11th in a couple of months. This one is not a surprise to folks either. Every year, due to inflation, in the last few years, you're going to have adjustments after the most recent law change into the penalties that come into both EPA and into the OSHA. OSHA here has their penalty minimums for serious, other than serious, willful repeat violations, and then also posting requirements. And then they go up to the penalty maximum. Keep in mind the rules have been changed, that these are now per infraction. It can be compounded and added on after the interpretation that was done in 2022. Also keep in mind that these are also retroactive in that they are also in terms of the going back to say 2018 in some of these cases. If you had a violation there that is still being adjudicated, when it does come through, it will be down at these higher penalty levels, and keep those in mind. Sticking also with the OSHA timeframe, you all are all aware, and by now you should know your 300 days, but we've been discussing your 300s and your 301s for those of you with 100 or more FTEs. And you know that you've got your filing is due on March 2nd coming up, your injury illness data. For those of you that have maybe not had to do your 300 and your 301s electronically in the past, OSHA is holding a open webinar coming up this coming Wednesday on February 7th from 1 to 2 Eastern. And there's a link down at the bottom for you all or your HR folks to take a look at that if they want to get more comfortable with that. We always caution, do not wait until the last day, the March 1st or 2nd. You never know, especially now that you have such a larger group rather than just the 250 or up. It's now 100 employees or up. Significantly increases the number of employers that will be required to file for their facilities a 300 and 301. So please be sure to get those in, or at least plan accordingly. If you haven't set up a username, a login, and gone through the training, maybe you want to do the February 7th webinar. A reminder, all of you should have already done this by now, but yesterday, February 1st, you should have posted your 300As out in your shops. Reminder, those have to stay up until and through April 30th. There's some additional information down there if you need some links on there. This one, I'll give a hat tip to my wife, who's an attorney that works on Federal Trade Commission matters and flagged on the Made in USA enforcement. It was either last summer or the year prior when we saw an increase in Made in USA enforcement from the Biden administration. We did have a webinar for the association, and then also we included a lot of slides over time in our slide deck here for both groups. But this is the largest penalty that was ever made in the US by a tractor maker. This one was clearly willful in terms of not aftermarket, but replacement parts rather, for some of the tractors were made entirely overseas, is what the finding was. And so this is an enforcement penalty. Usually, if it happens, most of the time it's somebody just did not know. This one clearly was on a willful, but it shows that the Federal Trade Commission and the government are increasingly focused on the cracking down on Made in USA labeling. And a reminder on that, if you need additional information, please reach out to us. But that is not the Buy America, so that's not government contracting. Made in USA is a label and is a claim that you're making about all the content, including the steel in your product, being sourced in the United States in order to be able to legally affix that label of Made in USA to the box and to the labels when you ship out to a customer. As I mentioned on the OSHA side, we still also do have our increase in inflation, 3.2% on the civil penalties. They apply everything to Toxic Substance Control Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, RCRA, everything. You can go through them all. They're all the different increases that are coming down, and those are again also some of the max, and they are now for any violations going back retroactive to 2015 in some cases as well. Dusting up some cobwebs for some of you. You may have, a few of you companies still have a Paycheck Protection Program loan or an emergency or an economic injury disaster loan that you might have taken out during the COVID times. If you chose or you were not able to have your loan fully forgiven, they are looking at programs that they are implementing now to allow borrowers that have loans of under $100,000 to look at some kind of a good grace period and a goodwill exception of 60 days that would last through March 3rd. And during that period, SBA will work on some outreach to help with some repayment opportunities and options for those individuals and those companies rather that have some hardship and set up some repayment plans. So that's something to watch on that in order to avoid the type of situation you do not want to be in when you do not pay a loan back to your US federal government. We've mentioned now, as John indicated, on the employee retention credit, that's out there, employee retention tax credit, it's all similar. The IRS is offering a webinar also on February 8th about voluntary disclosure program that we had mentioned in the past. If you felt that there was going to be an issue with your claim that you might have talked into. And while this webinar is largely for some of your tax professionals, if you do believe that you are in a situation where you do need to review your ERTC claim and you might want to go in after an incorrect filing that was an advice that you received, it might not be a bad idea to have somebody just listen in. Hopefully no one in our shops is dealing with that issue there as well. This is one that probably needs a lot more discussion for each individual company, but we wanted to flag it. What the IRS came up on January 12th was initial guidance to help employers to implement a pension-linked emergency savings accounts for individuals that were authorized as part of the Secure 2.0 Act. That's the one that also increased the retirement benefit age to, I think, 72.5. That had a number of retirement changes that were in there that somebody in your HR department probably is on top of. But just know, in case some of your employees or this comes up as an option, that employers can offer these accounts for these pension-linked emergency savings accounts with respect to contributions that are made, and you can match contributions subject to certain restrictions starting on January 1st of 2024 for some of these plans. They're not tax deductible, but the withdrawals are generally considered tax-free, and the participant can withdraw funds that are held into these at least once a month as necessary. Again, not trying to encourage you to get more involved in your employees' personal lives, but over 20 years, I've heard stories from many of you telling us about how you've helped individuals. This just might be a little bit more of an official and secure way of going about it for those of you that are in interest. Lastly, to round out on the regulatory side here, where we are, Department of Energy is offering an on-site energy program where they can look at a number of different opportunities and technical assistance from different energy sources, renewable fuels, heat pumps, geothermal, combined heat and power, battery storage. Just putting it out there that they are starting to increasingly look at engagement and outreach to industry. And specifically, the on-site energy program seeks to leverage their different technical assistant partnerships and different networks across the country, so that way they can help the industrial facilities and the other large end users of energy to do some kind of on-site clean energy technologies. So before maybe you go directly to some consultants, there might be some opportunities in your region to at least have somebody. It can't hurt. Maybe you're not doing it today, but you might do it in a year or two. Maybe it can't hurt to have that conversation and just get a little bit smarter earlier on if it even applies to you based on your scale and your region that's out there, just to throw it out. Just to wrap up here, there's a few items as we get into trade and tariffs that we wanted to flag for you. Just a number, we like to put in at least one economic data slide that we put out in the past. Again, who knows if you can trust it, it comes from China. But this is, again, reinforcing the narrative that we've seen over the last 12 months or so with regards to the changing dynamic and some of the exports from China. Certainly, they're still coming to the US, often through Vietnam, which we'll touch on in a minute. But a large part, you're seeing increasingly the Chinese shipping down into ASEAN, that's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And why you want to be cautious about that is increasingly it's going to be components and not just finished goods that they're shipping over, and those components are competing often with you. They'll be going on to a Southeast Asian nation and then showing up at a OEM near you in the US. And that's something that we're watching and keeping track of, which is why charts like that are as helpful. And speaking of which, in Vietnam, on September 8th of last year, Vietnam officially petitioned the Department of Commerce to change its economic status from non-market economy to one of having market economy status. This followed some comments over the summer where Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo said, basically was interpreted to have said that if you submit this application, it would be approved. That obviously set off a firestorm. They did officially set up that initial review. The Department of Commerce has begun the review as of October 31st of last year. What this effectively entails, if you currently have non-market economy status, as you see, like China and many of these countries over on the right-hand side, including Russia, what it means is when it comes to anti-dumping, but primarily anti-dumping cases, that you do not use that country's data. So for example, when we're dealing right now with imports coming in from China and you're proceeding with an anti-dumping or countervailing duty case, you don't trust the data for how they're pricing that stamp or that tool or that machine part coming out of China. You look at what that product is and you compare it to Mexico, you compare it to Thailand, another country that has a similar type of economic structure, but is a market economy, and then you use those numbers and then apply a margin that is typically higher. So having a non-market economy status allows the Department of Commerce typically to apply a higher dumping margin on products that are sold at below fair market value into the US. So it's an important tool that manufacturers have been using. We fought in 2007 to expand the law to allow the use of countervailing duties to fight subsidies on also non-market economies for the first time as well. So note that there's been on the left-hand side a number of senators led by Sherrod Brown and others in the House as well, led by Rosa DeLauro, are pushing back on the Commerce Department, opposing this change, saying it does not meet at least 5 of the 6-factor tests that are prescribed under the trade laws with regards to non-market economy status from 1930. So that's something to track, especially if you are concerned about imports, not just from Vietnam, but potentially passing through there as well. And then another one on really focused on Southeast Asia. Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is a negotiating platform that was used by the Biden administration to try to bring together in an effort to counter China's rise in the region. And they began negotiations on supply chain resiliency and tried to create a mechanism to identify disruptions and get out ahead of them. And this is a result of that. EIF means entry into force. It is now that agreement entering into force on February 24th of this month. And that deals with the Supply Chain Council, the Crisis Response Network, and then the Labor Rights Advisory Board. All of those are starting to trigger in, which theoretically would create some kind of partnership and alert systems along those ways. And then lastly, before I turn it over to Caitlin on the next slide, just want to flag, we talked about this quite a bit, believe in our October or November a slide deck with regards to the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism platform. As a reminder, on October 1st, the CBAM, they put out their information on which industries are going to be required starting on January 1st of this year to report on their carbon footprint. And there's quite a few in there. It hits a couple of our HTS, but it primarily focuses iron and steel, aluminum, lime, cement, and a few other industries and hydro and over along those lines. But they do now officially have the portal that is up and running. Right now, it is just a reporting on the carbon footprint for these products that are being exported into the European Union. In 2016, exporters will now have to start paying a tariff based on the carbon that's being put there. It's important to know from your standpoint what it means to you all is you could be receiving inquiries from some of your tier ones, OEMs, and others if you yourself are not exporting into the European Union of some of these more finished products. You might end up getting inquiries increasingly over time to watch on those. But Caitlin, I'll turn it back over to you to take us kind of back to taxes.
Thanks. A couple of things I wanted to highlight here. So on previous webinars, we have made requests for people to serve as media volunteers. And I just want to give you a little example of why we do that and why it's so important. So this week, as Omar and John were describing, we had this really important tax bill being considered and then ultimately passed by the House. These are two press releases that we put out as this was being put together. And press releases are obviously a really important strategy for us to talk about why something is important to us and call on Congress to take action. But something that we did this time on the next slide that I want to draw your attention to as well is we asked members of NTMA and PMA to tell us their own stories and give us their experiences. And we went to our media volunteer list and we said, hey, would you send us a quote? This is pretty typical on an advocacy communication issue. We are asking not only for the heads of the associations, people that we always turn to, and everybody knows that David and Roger are just so excellent in making your voices heard. But then we also go to members and say, hey, we really want to tell your stories. We want these quotes to be used on the Hill and then also with media. And these are quotes that we received back. You can see they're all really, really powerful. And what we ended up doing with them is sharing them with members' offices as they were considering this legislation to really drive home the point of why this bill was so important and what difference it would make to small and medium-sized manufacturers. Then when we sent the press release out, we also sent all of these quotes out to members of the media. And on the next slide, what you can see is we immediately got response back. This is just some of the outlets who responded to us and asked us if they could have opportunity to talk to our manufacturers. So Wall Street Journal, of course, Politico, a really high profile inside the Beltway Hill publication, Punchbowl News, same thing. Law 360 is also a Beltway publication that drives coverage around legislation and particularly what's happening in the regulatory space. So this is just an example. It is so powerful when individual members and member companies are willing to share their experiences. We've already had a member from NTMA and a member from PMA speaks to the Wall Street Journal. We're expecting that story by Monday at the latest. So, this is really important. And I think that when we have this kind of thing happen, as Omar and John alluded to, this is a piece of legislation and a policy issue that One Voice has been advocating on for years. It's really important that we make sure that that is clear, not only through our lobbyists and through the heads of the associations, but also from individual members. So a little case study here, definitely a success story in making our voices heard and driving the policy conversation. And then more than that, I think it is an opportunity for me to say thank you very much for raising your hand, for responding to our calls, giving us quotes so quickly, making yourselves available for interview. That's really, really important, and we're grateful for it. Another quick promo here. Listen to our podcast if you don't already. You can find the show Talking with One Voice on any podcast platform. We've mentioned on the Monday calls, but I don't think here on the webinar, that our latest episode is on this tax bill, what's in it, what it means for manufacturers. Then generally, we also get into a little bit more of the politics part of policy on the show as well. So look for that podcast wherever you like to find your podcasts.
Thank you, Caitlin. Those that have any questions, please, now's the time to start typing in the right-hand side. If you want more details for us to expand on taxes or anything else that we've gone through, thank you for all those that you do continue to support the NTMA and the PMA and our advocacy efforts that make this possible. And we're getting close on taxes. We're not there yet, and it's going to be a bumpy road here for the next several weeks. But as John mentioned, we really do appreciate everybody that did the action alert. And to Caitlin's point, those quotes that you all provided are extremely helpful when we're in our lobbying efforts. We send those to committees, we send those to leadership. It really does help push things over the edge. Again, please, in the box on the questions or in the chat, either way, please feel free to type anything in the box on the right-hand side. We'll stick on here for a few more seconds and answer any questions you may have. Okay. Seeing none in there, reminder, we did put out with our notification on after the vote the other night with regards to the tax bill on Wednesday. You also received a link to do your latest action alert. That one only goes to the Senate. That's where our focus is. You will likely see another action alert from us in the next 10 days or so. Please do continue to fill those out and keep the pressure up if you have not already done so. Thank you all very much. Please reach out if you have any questions, and we'll talk to you next month.